well. I am recording now. All right. So take it away. And I do want to encourage everyone. We're here to have a dialogue tonight. So we might not all agree, but hopefully we can have a good exchange of views, learn something from each other. And we're interested to hear what you have to say. So thanks a lot, Peter.
Nina, thank you very much. And thank you to your Civic Association, Arlington View, for inviting me. And definitely, I'd like to have a dialogue with you after I finish presenting. I'll stay as long as you want me to answer questions. Just a brief introduction of myself. I'm a 23-year resident of Arlington. I've lived in 2 or 3 places around the county, and I've been involved in civic affairs here in Arlington for about the last 20 years. I've been had a stint as chair of the Arlington County Democratic Committee. I was chair of the Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission to the Arlington County Board, co-chair of the Council on Instruction to the School Board. And I currently write a column for arlnow.com twice a month. And I've done a number of other things as well. And I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about the county's proposal for missing middle housing. And I'd like to emphasize the title of this presentation, A Community-Based Approach to Development, because that's a principal focus of ours. We believe that decisions about things like this really have to come from the bottom up and not the top down. So if we could move to the next slide. This is a slide that depicts the county's own estimate of population growth in Arlington. This was prepared in 2018 before Amazon decided to locate its headquarters here, before COVID. But at that time, they were projecting a population growth from 2020 of about 238,000 population to over 300,000 in 2045, a very large increase in population of about 65,000 people. And if we could move to the next slide to give us a sense of what does that mean to add 65,000 more people to Arlington? Well, if you look at this map, the cities of Charlottesville and Culpeper together have about 65,000 people in them. So, and those 2 cities together have got 20 schools, 29 parks, 4 libraries, 4 police stations, a bunch of transit routes. And so to accommodate here in Arlington, another 65,000 people as the county is forecasting, we're going to have to find room and space for all those kinds of public facilities if we want to maintain the kind of quality of life and public services that we're used to. And part of the missing middle issue presents the question, who's going to pay for all this extra infrastructure? Where are we going to put it? And what should we do to plan for it? Let's move to the next slide. The reason it's important to look at these questions of how many more people we're expecting before any kind of increased housing and density that might come out of the missing middle program is that studies have shown, a number of different studies have shown that for every new resident we add as a county, it's a net cost to our budget on average of $850 per year. In other words, it's not a positive financially, it's a negative. And that number here on this slide was based on a study by Stephen Fuller of the Schar School at George Mason, who is a prominent regional economist. Again, this was made before Amazon, but also before COVID. And it's consistent with a lot of other studies that reach the same conclusion. Let's move to the next slide. Right now, in the wake of COVID, our budget is getting really hit pretty hard. We had a pre-COVID budget forecast that was already estimating substantial budget deficits in the out years. And in the last year, in 2020, County Manager Mark Schwartz warned us about the impacts that COVID was going to have. and the fact that we would be potentially running deficits if we weren't careful. And he's now just recently, earlier this month, just a few days ago, actually, he's come out with his new budget, which contains quite a few cuts in programs and staff. It manages to balance itself, but these out-year deficits are significant, and they are impacting on how we're going to handle this extra population that we're expecting to come here without any zoning changes. Let's move to the next slide. One of the concerns that our group has, Arlingtonians for a Sustainable Future, is about basically the increasing influence that we see that big developers have on county decision-making. This slide is based off of a report to shareholders that was made by a company called Vornado that used to be a fairly large developer in Arlington before they merged with JBG Smith. And when this was prepared, JBG Smith was boasting about the fact that they expected to be the major developer of multifamily assets in the DC metro area. And now 4 years later, 5 years later, they certainly are that. For example, they own more than 50% of the developable land in Crystal City in the Route 1 corridor where Amazon decided to locate. So let's move to the next slide. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the Missing Middle program. Originally, the Missing Middle program was something that was talked about by the county really beginning in 2018 and 2019. And at the time, they were holding out some kind of hope that the additional so-called missing middle housing that was going to come out of their study would be affordable housing. It would be housing that would be affordable to average people. But in the fall of 2020, they basically changed their tune on that. And now they've given up on claiming that this new housing would really be affordable. And now they're saying we need to have this housing because we need some of these missing middle housing types are underrepresented in the county, even though, in fact, we have duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes in many parts of the county already based on existing zoning. And more of them can be built based on existing zoning. So they're really not missing, and they're really not going to be very helpful to the ordinary middle-class person. One of the things we're also concerned about basically is gentrification. And we've talked about on our website a project on the other end of the pike from you guys, the Marion Pike West project, where some relatively affordable garden apartment units are being scheduled to be demolished and replaced by some new housing that's going to be more expensive. We're not sure where the existing tenants are going to live. And there are also very significant adverse impacts on schools, overcrowding, tree canopy loss, increased traffic, and otherwise. So let's move to the next slide. One of the other reasons that we're concerned about upzoning is basically because of the laws in Virginia. Upzoning is forever. If your local government decides it's going to allow more dense development in your community than is allowed now, and then 2 or 3 years later, everybody gets together and decides, gee, that was a mistake. Let's go back to the way it was. Let's change it back. You really can't do that anymore because Virginia has these property laws, and what they say is you would be taking away from the owner rights that you gave him before, and that's not permitted under Virginia law, and that's a real problem. So it's another reason to go slow and be careful about things like changing the zoning in your neighborhood. Let's move to the next slide. I mentioned earlier that there's this myth that's still going around, even though Housing Arlington and the county government has abandoned it, that if only we could create this extra housing, it would be affordable. But here on this slide, we've got an example of a property that basically had the potential to build on it of a single family house that would have probably gone on the market for 1.6 million. And instead, in a place where it's already authorized to create a duplex, the developer decided to do that, to build these two townhouses on Dinwiddie Street. Each one of these duplex townhouses sells for $1.1 million. And that's indicative of the fact that housing prices in Arlington have been rising and rising and rising, even though we've been adding close to 3,000 new units of housing a year for the last 20 years. We're in a hot market. A lot of people want to live here. But with these prices rising the way they are, we've got lots of homeowners who are on fixed income, who can't really keep up with the tax bills, even if the rate isn't changed like the manager's proposing this year. The assessed values are rising, and so their tax bills are going up. And this sort of came to a head a few months ago with respect to a proposal to raise the so-called affordable housing AMI limits along Columbia Pike for subsidizing housing in certain units that previously had an 80 AMI cap on them. And there was a proposal to change that and to allow it to go up to about 120 AMI. A lot of civic associations along the Pike, along with our group, Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future, the NAACP, and a couple other groups came in and said, no, don't do that, because it's going to be less affordable if you do that than it is today. And the county board and the manager were forced to back off that proposal, and they abandoned it. Let's move to the next slide. We talked a little bit before about the pressure that the added population of an extra 65,000 people that we're expecting without any kind of missing middle proposal puts on our parks and our schools. This is a slide that shows a map that the county manager sent to APS in the fall of 2019, just before we came into the COVID year in 2020. And at the time, he was telling APS that they might be able to potentially use some sites that currently are either parks or community centers and convert them to APS schools. But the problem is that we don't have a long-term public facilities plan to accommodate these tens of thousands of people that are moving here. And so without that plan, we're facing decisions like this where we're cannibalizing something like a park, which maybe you can never get back, to make a school. And we really need to do that planning first before we talk about enabling additional density. Let's move to the next slide. Our existing infrastructure with the population we have today is under already tremendous pressure because a lot of it is so old. This slide is based on a huge water main break that occurred up near Chain Bridge at the end of 2019. It was such a big water main break, and it affected the entire community in Arlington. It led to shutting down the entire Arlington public school system for one day because of concerns about contamination in the water. And it's indicative of the fact that our water mains all over the county are very old, and we're not replacing them fast enough, and they break. And when they do, it causes something like this. And you add on to that 65,000 more people moving here, and you have a potential for real trouble. Let's move to the next slide. Flooding is another big issue that is impacted not only by climate change that we read about a lot nationally and in the whole world, but also by development, because as we indicate in the next slide, let's move to that, we have been adding impervious surfaces as a result of development here in Arlington, to the point where now we have about 45% of our surface area in the county covered by impervious surfaces. And that's an area that's equivalent basically of the footprint of the Pentagon that's becoming impervious in Arlington after every 3 to 4 years. And that means, of course, that when you get these harder rains as a result of climate change or anything else, it means the runoff is faster and the risk of flooding is greater. And another thing that impacts that is the loss of tree canopy in many neighborhoods. We've lost a lot of tree canopy in a number of places, and that means the rain hits the ground faster. And if it's more impervious, it starts running off quicker. So let's move to the next slide. Basically, what our group is saying is that already with existing zoning, we're expecting those 65,000 people, but we don't have an adequate plan to pay for the new schools, the transportation, the parks, and the services that we need. And we really need to develop those plans and have everybody understand what they are before we green light a lot of new additional density in neighborhoods that now don't permit these larger structures, so we can understand and really decide as a community whether this is what we want or whether it's what we want right now. So let's move to the final slide. Our group, Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future, has got this website that we mentioned down here at the bottom. And if there are questions that you have today that we don't have time to cover, you can send us an email at that Gmail address after the word questions. But basically what our group is asking the county to do now is to slow down on the missing middle proposal and do some long-term planning of the kinds we're talking about here. We're asking them to do a site-specific fiscal impact analysis for large new multi-unit residential projects. We're asking them to release long-term operating budget forecasts so we can have a sense of what things look like now before any kind of new zoning is green lighted. And then we'd like them to prepare and share with the community a sort of before and after with respect to 3 things based on current zoning and then based on the kind of upzoning they might be proposing for new missing middle housing. Long-term operating budget, a long-term environmental impact study, and an analysis of household income by quintiles. So we've got a sense for who's going to be able to afford to live in this housing, and is this really the way we want to direct our budget when we have lots of people who are struggling to find homes that they can afford, when there's lots of data to show that these missing middle homes are going to be really way far out of their price range. So with that, I'm going to stop and happy to stay and answer questions.